Hi, good evening, everybody. You're all welcome. I'm going to talk about monitoring Cork's otters. I'd like you to look at the picture in the middle of the screen, and you'll notice that the otter, it's a beautiful picture taken some years ago, has a moustache, and that moustache is idiosyncratic to the individual otter. That's quite an important part of what I'm going to say, because this is a golden opportunity when we can recognize individuals in a carnivore population. But of course, the point about this whole meeting is to raise money for Save Our Bride Otters. And I'll put up links to this when I finish the talk. So I'm going to look at three things. I'm going to look at the Irish otter, the otter in Ireland, which is a specific subspecies, Lutra roensis. It's darker and more dimorphic than otters elsewhere, and I'll go into that a little bit of detail. And a unique apex predator. It's the equivalent of having tigers in our freshwater and our coasts. And then I'm going to talk about monitoring otters on the Cork coast and the county and the city, and then mention climate change and the effect of floods and droughts that it might affect this population. And finally, I'm going to talk about why we specifically focus in on the bride at Blackpool. What's so important about that in the overall context of otters in Cork City and County. So to begin with, talk a little bit about the Irish otter in Ireland. This is the display in the Natural History Museum, or the so-called Dead Zoo in Dublin. And it's a family group of otters, male, female, and some cubs. The male in this particular subspecies is much bigger than the female. They're the most dimorphic otters on Earth. So the male comes in at 15 or 16 kilos, which is a very large animal. It's like a very, very large dog. The female is on average 6 to 10 kilos. She's much smaller. So you can tell the difference between the sexes of otters on camera. And that's highly useful. You can also tell the difference if you have a mature individual between the skulls. And the family portrait portrayed here is a total anthropomorphism. It has the male helping the young cubs with the fish. In fact, the males play no role in family life whatsoever, apart from bringing up the cubs. And in fact, they're a danger to the cubs, and the females avoid them by living up tributaries. And the males, by and large, patrol the main parts of the river. And while you get 3 or 4 cubs per litter, very, very, very few survive to adulthood. Typically, one survives. A colleague of mine in UCC was claiming during the week that otters frequently adopt other cubs, but in fact, that's the reverse. Otters typically kill other cubs, and very few survive. The female often deserts 1 or 2, and we're in danger of anthropomorphizing these wild animals, and this is something which we need to avoid. We need to recognize that they're individual wild animals, and they behave accordingly. They don't behave like little people in fur coats. The picture on the right is of the moustache, and to my mind, this moustache, it resembles the north coast of Eurasia until you get to the end when there's a little island. And you can see that's highly idiosyncratic, and you'll see from Chris's videos later on and photographs that this occurs throughout the Cork population. Therefore, we have an opportunity of tracking individuals and their life histories. So this is a very unique top predator in the Irish ecosystem that has a huge effect on the overall ecosystem because it's a top predator. In Cork, we have a remarkable 3 main rivers, all of which flow from east to west, or from west to east, and suddenly go southwards at a junction. So, for example, you can see in this slide, the River Blackwater flows from Mallow east to Cappoquin and then turns south. The River Lee flows to Cork and then turns south. And finally, the River Bandon flows through Bandon and then turns south to Kinsale. We don't quite know why this is, but it's very characteristic of all Cork's main rivers. And these have huge catchments. And a very significant thing about each of these catchments is each of them start in the mountains, and their flooding and their flow are determined by rainfall in the mountains. Most of the rainfall occurs in the mountains, and up in those mountains, there are quite significant otter populations. And in the surveys that I'm about to describe, the lowest occurrences were in those mountains. If and when climate change occurs, and we think it's occurring right now, those mountain flows will sometimes dry out. So probably most at risk otter populations are those in the mountains. As well as that, curiously, otter cubs drown. They don't know how to swim when they're born. They have to learn to swim, so they quite frequently get swept away by floods as well. So they're at risk from floods, as well, of course, of the risk of badly advised anti-flood operations, such as going to occur or is planned for the River Bride. So this is this old guy, Pat Smitty, like myself, and Pat has done a stupendous job in surveying otters on each of these river catchments. And we'll start with the River Blackwater. The black dots represent positive otters. And what Pat did was he went in at a bridge, walked for 600 and 700 meters. When he came across otter sign, which means sprint or tracks, it was a positive. That's a black sign. And then he repeated each of 3 times. And I'll show you the results at the end of this series of slides. So that's the Blackwater, which flows south from Cappoquin to Youghal Harbour. You can see most of them are immediately black, which means he encountered otter sign on the first visit. This is a similar survey he did on the River Bandon, and it's the same story. Most of them are dark to begin with. And again, that flows south to Kinsale. And finally, you've got the River Lee. This is a river we're particularly interested in tonight because Cork City is on the Lee catchment and the River Bride is on the Lee catchment. And you can see them there on your slide. And they're tiny parts of what is a large river catchment. And the population that we're talking about tonight is tiny in comparison to the overall population of the whole of Cork. But it's significant because it's become immensely symbolic in an argument about how to abate flooding. So if we take the number of positive signs for otters in Cork, we start with the coast. Now, otters are extremely plentiful on coasts, which probably explains why they're so common in the city. So roughly there's 1 otter for every kilometre of coast. And roughly in Ireland, we have about 3,000 kilometres of coast, of which 1,000, a little bit more, occurs in County Cork. So 1/4 of the otters, the coastal otters of Ireland, occur in Cork County. So that's a very significant number of otters. And there's probably a lot of interchange between the otters on the coasts and the otters in the rivers. And if we look at Pat's surveys of the River Blackwater, when he went back those 3 times, 93.7% of sites were positive, that's an extraordinarily high number. It compares with international comparisons of Scotland and England. They're talking about 50 to 70% of sites that are occupied. So this is a fantastic number of otters in the system, and it hasn't changed since the 1990s, since Liam O'Sullivan did the first survey way back then. On the Bandon, it's 97.1% of sites that were positive for otters. Again, he found positive sign on these sites. And the River Lee, it's 100%. So the River Lee is chock-a-block full of otters. And that's all good news from the otter conservation point of view. However, if otters are affected by climate change, we're going to need to monitor the population to figure out how they're trending, how the population is trending. And that means identifying individuals and having a population estimate for specific sections of the river. So I'm going to focus now on Cork City. This is where we've been surveying for a number of years. Since about 2005, we've been monitoring the population in the city. Here you see a map of the city, and you see there's a population out at Curraheen. You see there's a population around the city centre island. Otters really like islands, particularly low-lying islands such as in Cork City. And there's even otters around Patrick's Bridge, the so-called Pana otters. And there are otters on the Tramore River out near the horrible airport roundabout. And underneath that roundabout, there's a path that is in a tunnel underneath the roundabout. And in that tunnel, there's broken bottles and there's a dim wattage bulb lighting the whole thing. It's not a very pleasant place to walk through. And there's a rock, and on that rock, there's often otter sprays. So they can penetrate deep into tunnels, and they occur throughout the city. But the most important habitat of all that we've found so far is the River Bride in the north. And we know this because we've extracted DNA from otter sprains. Now, when we extracted the DNA from the otter sprains, only 10% of those sprains yielded DNA. So these are minimum numbers that I'm going to show you. So this is an aerial photograph of the city, and these symbols represent individual otters. And you can see that there's one female and one male out in Curraheen in the city centre, as you'd expect. There are two otters, and they're both males. Those are those otters, male otters, behaving as male otters do, patrolling the main part of the river. But in Blackpool, we have a remarkable number. Of the 11 otters that we identified in the city, 8 occurred within Blackpool, 4 males and 4 females that used the habitat. These were also found elsewhere in the city. 2 of the females are perhaps siblings. So that's a remarkable discovery, and it suggests strongly that the highest diversity of prey species available to the otters are in the Blackpool area. These are some of the volunteers that helped with this work. They didn't help with the DNA work. They helped in a later survey specifically of Blackpool, which I'll go on to in the slide after next. And you can see they're in waders. So this is Blackpool. This is, some of you will be familiar with the shopping centre there. And underneath the main Mallow Cork Road, there's this enormous culvert stretching in both east and west directions. And at the edge of this culvert, there's an otter underpass. This saves otters from getting drowned during floods. If you remember, I said that sometimes cubs can get drowned during floods and washed away. So this prevents them getting flooded, getting washed away. And you can see there's otter spraint at the edge of that otter underpass. Very important and significant habitat. This is probably one of the reasons why there's so many otters using Blackpool, because this saves them from becoming road traffic accident victims. This is a picture of spraint, otter dropping, otter shit, if you like. And this is how we extract the DNA from this. It's very specific looking stuff. It has fish bones right the way through it and has this extraordinary smell of jasmine. Once you smell it once, you never mistake it for anything else. And this is the main sign we use. We also use tracks, we also use slides, and we also look for hairs, but this is the main sign we use. And I just want to make a remark about otter habitats. We know that plants are very significant components of otter habitats. We know that reeds, for example, at the edge of a river, and particularly crack willow is very important for otters to mark their territories. This isn't a fun-loving willow. It's a willow that cracks in the breeze. And here you see one up near where I live in rural Killawan, and you can see the crack willow has created pond-like habitats at the edge of the river. And this benefits otters because they can fish in these ponds that have been cut off from the main river for sticklebacks and other things. And we think there's a remarkable, interesting ecological relationship between crack willow and otters. And most of the otter sprainting sites, the so-called seats, we find in Cork City, particularly, for example, between the University and Anglers Rest, something like 90% of the otter site seats are on or near crack willows. And they score the bark to leave scent on the bark. So that's just a remark about their habitats. So turning to the River Bride, or it's called the Blackpool River, this slide. Here you'll be familiar with the shopping centre here in the north of the picture. And what we did was we marked out otter seats. This is places where otters go to the toilet. That's not a tail at the end of the otter. That's signifying an otter dropping. And you can see we found over a year a lot of signs, a lot of holds. We used cameras. We found slides, we found tracks of otters, in fact, tracks of minks, and we found a kind of jelly, an exude from otters that's very useful for getting DNA. And we concentrated our attention on this Blackpool section in the middle of the slide. So we sent volunteers in all seasons for 3 days. Each of those 3 days, they monitored the spraints. So they took a photograph with their smartphone or whatever, and they uploaded that photograph and they had it on their cameras to begin with. And then in the following 2 days, they could identify new sprains because we were very interested in getting fresh sprains for DNA analysis. And I'll just give you an example of 2 of these, the results of 2 of these. One is in the spring. And here you can see the new sprains are marked by the green otter going to the toilet, and we found 4 new sprains in that section. We also had a number of old sites that the otters were using, and then we looked at it again that summer, and we found a lot more sprains, and we found sprains in each of the seasons. So not only were a lot of otters using this environment, but they were using it continuously for each season. So it's not only used by a large number of otters, but it's used all the time. And this is a very significant thing when it comes to when you're thinking of putting a culvert in the river and destroying the entire ecosystem, because the food for those otters will be removed. And you can get a more full account of this on the RT Brainstorm website, along with radio commentary on not only otter surveys here in Cork, but also in Galway, and some other stuff that's of use. So that's the environment that's threatened by the Office of Public Works Flood Abatement Programme. So just a few mentions about future monitoring, what we might do to monitor continuously from now on. And one of the things that the advantages of the work that we're doing here is that it's using non-invasive techniques such as looking at sprains, using camera traps, using CCTV. So you can avoid the anti-scientific regulators who try and prevent research, and it's available to anybody who wants to do it if they're sufficiently skilled. And Chris will show you the results of his work later on, which stunning photographs of video photographs of otters in the city. And it involves cameras, and cameras, of course, have changed out of all proportion in the last 10 years. You now get these automatic camera traps. We've got CCTV. We've all got smartphones. In fact, we've got entire television centers in our pockets. And this is particularly important because you can interface it with the internet. You can interface it with Facebook or TikTok. Given that teenagers, young people are deprived, they have what's called nature deficit disorder, this is a way of interacting with them and interesting them in an apex predator, which is in their environment. And the significance of rivers such as the Bride is that they're in urban areas. And we know that urban people are far more responsive to the biodiversity emergency than rural people. So it becomes particularly important that these predators survive in urban habitats. And I just want to say a few words about signs of otters. So what we're doing with these non-invasive techniques is we're looking for otter signs. We now realize that they dig a great deal more than we thought. They produce these sprains, these droppings, which are very important, a source of DNA. They use signs. We can look at tracks and tell the difference between males and females. We can extract DNA from the sprains and the hairs. And we've got this idea of having a conveyor belt for sprains that we recover. So if we recover a sprain and a photograph at the same time, the photograph would tell us by comparing the size if this is a cub, a male or a female. The sprain then goes off for DNA analysis so the individual can be identified. Then that sprain can go further in the system, have the diet, the prey species that's found in that sprain be identified, and pollutants such as plastics and pesticides. So the whole idea of a conveyor belt to give us a lot more information from these techniques, which I think is a great potential as a technique. Okay, these are the references to what I've been referring to. We've also done otter surveys in Dublin. I've done with Ross Macklin. This is the, Liam O'Sullivan was the first survey of the rivers of Blackwater in 1991. We've done surveys since 2005 with Paul Moore. We've also done surveys in the University District, and there Pat's 3 papers about the distribution of otters in the Cork area. And White et al. It records the DNA work that we've done up to now. But far more significantly are the links. I presume, Dominic, we can put these on the anyway, people can take a photograph now, or I'm sure that we can put them up on the website.
Put them up on social media, no problem afterwards, Paddy. Yeah.
And with it built into the RT Brainstorm article, the podcast by Derek Mooney and co, and somebody doing a survey in Galway. There's also a lecture on the internet, How Safe Are Irish Otters, which was part of a Cork Nature Network lecture series on natural flood management. and the Save Our Bride Otters, the website where you can donate some stuff. The other day we were invited, Chris and I, to do some streaming. Streaming seems to, so I just want to mention the fact that elsewhere in the UK there are urban otters. They're just beginning to wake up to this fact. And there's a link to the Natural History Museum, Discover Otters in urban UK. It's particularly interesting in the city of Edinburgh, where an urban otter population was causing a great deal of media attention in UK, and the city of Winchester in England. They're both websites that would be worth looking at. There are also urban otters in Korea, Singapore, and Cape Town that are being studied. And there's a colleague of mine in UK, Stephen Powells, and he's been looking at moustaches and other things to identify individual otters, and has been having some success with wounds and stippling of the pelts. I just mentioned him in passing because it's quite important that we have colleagues abroad. So, live streaming, music, worship plays are now live streamed. My friend and colleague Frank McGuinness has a play called The Visiting Hour about the current pandemic on at the gate, which you can go and see live stream. But a TV crew came and announced that they're going to live stream us the other day, and they produced a seat. And this was literal live streaming. We were put sitting in the seat in the middle of a stream, and it's live streamed. And I think this is being live streamed at the moment. Okay, there were a great many people and organizations involved in this work: FOTA, Wildlife Park, Mammals in a Sustainable Environment, the Irish Wildlife Trust, my own colleagues in Bees in UCC, Cork Nature Network, and various government departments, etc. But most important people are the many, many volunteers, and obviously people who are going to donate to SOBO. Thank you very much for listening to me.